Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. I'm so excited about today's guest. I spoke with the incredible Fatima Manji, award-winning broadcaster and journalist, about her book, Hidden Heritage. Hidden Heritage is a myth-busting journey through Britain's history. Fatima takes us through heritage sites and British historical sources, rediscovering Britain's relationship with the Orient. I absolutely loved this book and found it fascinating and intriguing. Fatima shares stories and introduces us to artefacts and sources that point to a more nuanced and multi-layered relationship between Britain and the Orient, which Fatima believes to be West Asia and South Asia and North Africa. While sharing some really fascinating stories, she also sheds light on the darker side of history, encouraging us to reconsider some popular narratives of history and the way we approach society and issues today. Fatima Manji is an award-winning broadcaster and journalist who anchors the UK's Channel 4 News, the nation's most popular adversarial nightly news programme. She reports on major national and international stories and is best known for breaking stories with a global impact, including the tale of Saudi princesses held hostage for years by their father the king, giving voice to the heart-rending testimonies of internally displaced Iraqis fleeing ISIS, investigating an MI5 spy accused of entrapment in Northern Ireland, and tracing the perilous journey of victims of war across the Hungarian border in the face of rising anti-immigrant extremism. Hi Fatima, thank you so much for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your book, Hidden Heritage, which is like a little hidden gem which sheds light on so many, like hidden artefacts and stories when it comes to Britain's history. So please, if you could introduce your book and tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind it.
So yeah, as you say, Hidden Heritage is a journey around Britain. It takes you through museums, art galleries, stately homes, national trust sites, places of heritage. And it picks out a few objects, looks at the history of those objects, sort of uncovers the mystery around them, but then uses those objects to reflect on something modern day, political, cultural or social. For me, it began in a couple of ways. I mean, I first started thinking about this book sort of 2016, which many people will remember was a really intense political year. It was the year of Brexit and Donald Trump. And without taking a position on those specific issues, we can all agree that it was a really intense political year. And many of us felt that, particularly when you were working in news. So one of the things I started doing more and more was to sort of go to art galleries and museums, almost initially as an escape from my day job. But when I would go there, I would find that an object, a painting, a statue, a piece of artwork would suddenly catch my eye and it would feel unusual, or I'd have questions about it, questions which weren't always answered and the guides wouldn't have answers to them. And I'd go away and do a little bit of research about all of these things and then sort of mention them to friends and family. I'd say, oh my God, I never knew that existed, or I'd never even think to go into that place. And then that sparked an idea for me about, if we want to think about the future of Britain and we want to have a conversation politically and socially and culturally, then we do need to think about how we present the past, who has access to that past, and who is allowed to speak about that past with authority. And so that was one of the motivations in terms of writing this book, was to share these stories with people because I felt that they were interesting and people would enjoy them and they should be shared because they're interesting in their own right, but also to tell a sort of a story about Britain and its past, not shy away from whether it's colonial heritage or looking at a time when before Britain even existed, when it was just England, the smaller parochial power on the world stage, was looking to the east. It was looking to South Asia and West Asia, what we might now call the Middle East, and I call the Orient as a sort of broad term, for inspiration and trying to emulate the East almost. And so that was really the idea behind writing the book. I'm sure we'll talk through specific examples about some of the things that we discover in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tagline of the book is rediscovering Britain's relationship with the Orient. And I just want want, if you don't mind, to reflect on that word. Like, you've chosen specifically to use the word Orient, which you refer to as kind of like South Asia, West Asia, North Africa. But why did you decide to use that particular word?
It's a decision that I really agonised over for a long time, because I thought, well, what draws all of these places together? Okay, some of them are linked to the British Empire. If we're talking about, say, the Indian subcontinent, we can talk about the British Empire, but not all of them. I mean, Morocco was not a part of the British Empire and features quite heavily in the book. So we can't talk about just empire. So I agonised about that term for a long time, because I had to think about what is it that draws all of these objects and places and histories together, apart from me finding them interesting. And first you think, well, maybe you should talk about the empire, the British Empire. And if we're talking about the Indian subcontinent, yes, that's fine. But Morocco features heavily in the book. That's not part of the British Empire. And indeed, the book starts at Tudor England under Elizabeth I. And there was no British Empire. There was no Britain at that time. So we can't use that term. And then I thought, well, maybe we should just use modern day terms like South Asia, West Asia, or the Middle East. But those terms aren't apolitical. Particularly the term Middle East is quite a contentious one, and is one that is imposed on the region. So to use those is not a neutral act either. In the end, I decided to use Orient. One, because I think it encapsulates the idea of there being a sort of a broader region that's influenced by each other beyond nation states or modern day geographical boundaries. And, I give an example of this in the book to explain, for instance, there's a piece of artwork that I talk about that you can go and see outside a museum on the south coast of England in Hove. And that piece of artwork was created by two men who were based in Punjab, which we would now say is in Pakistan, at the time was in India, British India, under the Victorian era. So they were from Lahore. They signed their names in Persian. So the script they were using was Persian. And the actual artwork itself was inspired by woodwork from North Africa, Egypt and Morocco. So could we just say, here is some artwork by some Pakistanis? It doesn't make sense. And I sort of wanted to encapsulate the idea of there being a sort of region beyond these nation states that we can talk about. And Orient would have been used in the time of all of these historical periods that we're writing about. But that's not to say that it's not problematic. And obviously, we don't want to engage in Orientalism. So this was about sort of reclaiming that word in a sense, but I still think it's not the perfect one. And if anyone has a better idea, I'm still open to hearing what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if there is a word that would encapsulate all of that, but what I love so much about both, I think, the use of the word, and you explain it in the book as well as to why you chose that term, is just a reminder of how interwoven history is globally. And I think we have this idea that for so long, when we think about the past, we think about everything being very kind of like rigid, and Britain is full of white people and India is full of brown people, and we have this idea of things being kind of the same and the same kind of people in the same kind of places, but that isn't the case. When you go to places like Turkey, you'll see remnants of culture and identity from Asia, from Britain, from Europe. Like, there's so much, and that isn't something that's new. That's something that's happened over hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think your book is basically a series of a myth busting. Like, I love it. I think it's honestly like it helps us rethink so much about what the kind of the popular history that we have been told. And one of the things that you talk about is this conflict from the Victorian era and before between this curiosity about the Muslim world and Muslim culture and faith, but also this sort of fear, and then I guess slightly later this object of conquest. And I wondered if you could just reflect on that a little bit, because I think we assume that so much was driven by fear, or if not fear, like distaste, or this idea that this community or this country or this society is not living its best life, it's not quote unquote civilized. hate that word, but that's the kind of the idea that we have before. But actually your book shows us that, well, actually there was this real curiosity and this real attitude to embrace language, embrace culture, food. There was, you know, gifts exchanged and coffee. Yeah, so I just wondered if you could reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, so you know, of course, many of the characters and countries that I talk about are part of the Muslim world, but you know, it's important to say that there are Hindus and Sikhs and Christians in the book also, which is why I don't just talk about the Muslim world. But on that specifically, I sort of trace an evolution through the book. So we start at Tudor England. England is the parochial power on the world stage. You've got the global superpower of the day, the Ottoman Empire. And then you also have the Safavid and the Mughal empires. Nobody really knows where England is outside of the small European context, and it's really important to remember that. And you have Elizabeth I has cut off from Catholic Europe. She's looking for new economic and political alliances, and so she turns to Moroccan kingdoms, she turns to the Ottoman superpower, and she turns to a slightly lesser extent, but she also turns to the Mughals and the Safavids. Yeah, so we have this idea of sort of, it's not about conquest at that point, because you know this is a smaller power looking to the bigger powers. They're looking to emulate what's going on, to be a part of this economically, you know, have a share in it economically, but also there's kind of real admiration for certain things culturally, whether it's people wanting to sort of import Turkish carpets, or a later extent the sort of importation of coffee, which I'll talk about in a second. But at the same time, there's a fear. There's a fear of being turned Turk. And by that, they mean people turning Muslim or becoming too Muslim. So at the same time as you have the Queen of England seeking these alliances, you also have people on the streets singing anti-Turk ballads. And coffee becomes a really interesting example, for instance, because coffee, you know, originates from Yemen, but becomes quite big in the Ottoman Empire, is brought through Europe and brought to England to coffee houses. The very early coffee houses are very, very associated with the symbol of the Turk. So the actual adverts for the coffee houses are the proprietor in a turban outside the coffee houses. So it's clear that this, you know, this is a Turkish drink. And you have people who are, you know, taken up by this drink, and coffee houses become important economically and politically later. But at the same time, you have a backlash against coffee. So you have these sort of rants against coffee being written in papers and being shared. You know, there's a sort of slightly ridiculous women's petition against coffee that may or may not have been written by a woman. And she bemoans the idea that her husband is taken by this Turkish enchantress. And, you know, the thought is that drinking this coffee may turn you Turk, may turn you Moorish, may turn you swarthy. So it's associated with race. It's called dirty, muddy, puddle water. And one of the reasons for this is economic, because the coffee houses are a rival to ale houses. And so some of that is being driven by sort of economic fear. But also there's this, you know, I think a genuine fear of Muslims and Islam at the time, coupled with curiosity. So it's sort of, we want to be like you. We quite like a lot of the things that you've got. We want a part of this, but we're also a little bit scared. And then as we evolve through the book, you have the development of the British Empire. So, you know, we get to the sort of Georgian period and the Victorian period. The Victorian period is where the British Empire is really at its height. And now you have a situation where Queen Victoria, you know, is the Empress of India. It's argued that she actually presides over more Muslim subjects than many other Muslim rulers do by this point, given the numbers of Muslims in the Indian subcontinent. And so now you have very open conquest over certain lands, and a desire to, instead of saying we want to be like you, it's you should be like us. So by the time the very first Ottoman Sultan makes his visit to Britain under the Victorian era, there's a sense that, you know, we need to civilize him. We need to make him more like us, and he needs to learn our ways. And so there's been a shift in the power dynamic. And yet, even while plunder and conquest and real economic, political conquest is taking place, and I don't want to take away from the brutality of what's going on under empire at this time, there is still a curiosity over artwork, over dress, over language. And yes, you know, British civil servants are learning Urdu and Farsi and Arabic, not because they just love the language, but because they're using it to rule over certain territories. But there is also at the same time a genuine appreciation of these languages, a genuine appreciation of the art and the culture. And I don't think that we can shy away from that, because two things can be true at once. And that's why I talk about this sort of constant tension between curiosity and conquest. And that curiosity is not just innocent. We can't just say, "Oh, how wonderful that the British people wanted to speak Urdu," because it's not it's not altruistic in any way. It's not just because of the love of the language, but it did exist, and there was, I think, a genuine appreciation, even while this desire to conquest and to change these lands and peoples to be more like us existed.
Well, I find Queen Victoria, herself, really fascinating, because she, I mean, you talk about it in the book, but also I've seen the film, is it called Abdul and I, which is about her relationship with the Munshi of Abdul Karim, right? Which is so fascinating, because it shows a lot that she had this real interest in learning not only to speak Urdu, but to write in Urdu. And she developed this friendship with the Munshi, and she learned so much from him. And, you know, and she's got an interest in carpets and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, the situation politically around the world with regards to the empire is so fraught. And I don't know too much about historical sources, but at least in the film, she comes across very detached from it as well, which I also found really fascinating. And the fact that she had this almost like a conflict, because she had this personal interest, this relationship with her Munshi, but everybody around her was against that. And I think it came to, at the end, after her death, her son kind of burned everything and wanted to get rid of all of that influence and evidence of the closeness of the relationship with the Munshi. And I find that so fascinating, because that was the Victorian era, but so much of that has been lost.
I mean, you mentioned the film. I'm personally not a huge fan of the film. You know, I think it's interesting to sort of bring the story of Victoria and Abdul Karim the Munshi to a wider audience, but I thought it was a little bit reductive. Having looked at her what remains of her diaries and letters and the archives around this, you know, I think that there was a lot more that actually needed to be told, and the film was a little bit simplistic and kind of problematic in places. That's not to say we don't love Judy Dench, we do, but you know, I think you're right to raise this sort of there was a conflict between Victoria the person and Victoria the Empress. So you know, I think when you look at Victoria's sort of interests and friendship with Abdul Karim, it was very genuine, I think, and that comes across. You know, even though Edward VII, her son, burnt those letters, we still have her diaries, and it's clear that she takes genuine pride in this friendship. This is someone who isn't just a servant to her. She values his opinion, and not just his opinion, but she became friends with his wife, who came to live with him, and his wife used to wear a niqab. She used to cover her face. And Victoria used to take great pride in the fact that she'd go over to Frogmore Cottage, which some of you may know was most recently the home of Harry and Meghan, but that's where Abdul Karim the Munshi used to live. That was the home that Victoria gave to him, and his wife used to live there. And Victoria used to take great pride in going over there and having chats with her friend Abdul Karim and his wife, and saying, look, you know, because I'm a woman, she doesn't have to cover her face in front of me. She really understood the concept of wearing a niqab, which I also think people would find quite astonishing today, to think, you know, one of the greatest queens of Britain was sort of hanging out with a niqabi, as it were. So I think that friendship is genuine. She really does take an interest in learning Urdu. You know, they're on special exhibitions sometimes at Kensington Palace or Osborne House or other places. So do look out for them. You can actually see Victoria's writing in Urdu, and it's really, really interesting to see. You know, she writes at, you know, it's quite at a simple level, but she'd learnt to write the script. She'd be writing weather reports and how her day was going, etc. And I think that was very genuine. And yet, this is the person who's presiding over the British Empire. And okay, granted, she's not personally enacting acts of brutality, but she is the symbolic figure for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that, you know, we can't get too enthusiastic about Victoria, the sort of the friend of a Muslim man, without placing it in that context. And you know, what was happening in terms of her own court is her courtiers became concerned that Abdul Karim was influencing her to the extent that she was then making remarks about policy in British India. You know, she'd be asking her courtiers about this or that, why are we doing this and why are we doing that, based on what Abdul Karim was telling her, because he was this trusted advisor. So there was a real fear that this friendship was actually jeopardizing the interests of empire. And there's a sense in which her courtiers tried to manage Victoria, and certainly tried to manage Abdul Karim, not just because of personal jealousy, but because of the impact it might have on policies over British India. So I think that's it's a very interesting example of something where we can sort of understand a personal story, but we have to place it in the political context of what was going on.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that her courtiers were so against her friendship with the Munshi wasn't just because he's from India, or, you know, he's Muslim, or he's got brown skin. It was, I think, historically a lot more sinister, because they feared that it was going to affect the empire, essentially. And I think you're right. We can't forget that. We can't dilute that fact either. And yeah, I mean, the film definitely dilutes that bit, doesn't it? So, but yeah, so one of the other things that your book does a lot about is it flips the narrative around migration. So the popular narrative we have is sort of that migration really happened after Empire Windrush and after World War II, and then we had, like, you know, people come from India, Pakistan to become doctors, and, you know, we that's the kind of popular narrative that we're told, and still I think that is still the main message that we're given. But your book actually tells us to look at things and to understand that history is not that like that. It's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more complicated. And I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's certainly the case that mass migration begins at the Empire Windrush. You know, I'm not pretending that there were thousands of Moroccans here during the era of Queen Elizabeth I. But my point is that there were individuals, there were groups of people, and there were definitely cultural influences that then sowed the seeds for what would happen later. And so, if we only think about that modern era of Empire Windrush and mass migration, you end up with a situation where you think about whether it's people of colour or Muslims specifically as only being very recent arrivals to the British Isles, when actually there are the sort of cultural roots and political roots that predate that. And, you know, that the earliest examples I go into is going back to Elizabeth I, as she's fostering these new links with the Ottoman Empire and the Moroccan kingdoms. She exchanges letters with the Sultan and gifts, but with the Moroccan kingdom, she actually receives ambassadors. And so we have these incredible stories of Moroccan ambassadors first coming to the Tudor and later the Stuart court, and quite detailed accounts that I've been able to find of their trips around England. And so they were entertained at the highest levels, at the homes and courts of British nobility, as well as the monarchs. They sort of, go to Cambridge and Oxford to, these seats of learning, and are welcomed, and lots of people, sort of mass public turns out to come and see them. There's a lot of interest in them. And so you have a sort of accounts of Muslim men being hosted at the very highest circles of the English nobility, and who are practicing Muslim men. You know, we have accounts of them praying, or of slaughtering meat according to halal methods. And this is obviously remarked upon by people at the time. It's not condemned; it's remarked upon as, this is what they're doing, which I think is very fascinating, and it sort of disrupts our idea of Tudor and Stuart England. I mean, I don't know about you, but certainly myself and many other people I've spoken to, people who particularly went to school in England. I mean, it's not necessarily the case if you went to school in Scotland, but people who went to school in England hear a lot about the Tudors a lot of the time. You know, I felt like I knew a lot about Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and yet I never ever was introduced to the idea of there being links to the Ottomans or the Moroccans. It sort of, it almost divorced what was happening beyond England. And so, I thought it was quite important, actually, to place that context for people about, what was happening at the time and who Elizabeth was seeking to interact with. Because it does shift our narrative, actually, about what we imagine the place of people of colour or Muslims to be in Britain. If we suddenly say that, well, did you know that Elizabeth I had these Muslim men that she entertained in her court, who were respected and treated with great curiosity and dignity. And again, economic and political reasons were driving it. It wasn't just because, oh yes, we want to be nice to the Muslims. But it does shift the narrative slightly of what we imagine the place of those of us who are products of immigration to be on these islands, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well how we perceive racism and the evolution of racism as well, because I guess the immediate, if your only view is that, well, Britain has only been full of white people for hundreds and hundreds of years, and all of a sudden we have this mass migration, then you can understand that, okay, well, yeah, well, that must, if you have never seen a person of color and all of a sudden there's like thousands arriving, you can understand that, okay, well, that must be a shock to society, and that's going to cause some friction. But if we understand that actually there has been a connection partly driven by trade and economic interest, but also curiosity and friendship, then it changes the way that we view whether racism or how racism existed in the Tudor era or the Victorian era, and then how it has changed, and whether it has changed because people have changed, or is it politics? Is it something a lot more sinister? And I find that as well, there's a lot more emphasis, especially on retelling Black history as well in the UK. And so much of some of the backlash or some of the questions that people get is, well, do you not think that racism would have also been fraught in the Victorian time? But these historians are pushing back, and they're like, well, no, because everything was so different, because we didn't have the mass migration, and we didn't have, the political circumstances were so different, especially in the UK, when we don't have the history of slavery in the same way that it is in the States, for example. So yeah, like I always find that really fascinating, that we think about racism and prejudice in the way that we think that we experience it today, but we live in very different circumstances to what was the case in Victorian England. And the fact that you encourage us to think and to understand that actually relations between communities and across the world were a lot more nuanced and complicated, but also maybe a little bit more open to learn from each other and to exchange from each other, because everybody was trying to build themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be rose tinted about that. While I draw out what you might consider positive or encouraging or inspiring stories, alongside that there is also deep brutality. There's economic exploitation, and so in the middle of the book we have a key chapter about Tipu Sultan, an Indian king who who ruled over the kingdom of Mysore in the south of India. He's one of the examples of the British Empire really at the height of its brutality in the Indian subcontinent. And I write about what happened to his kingdom and his objects. And so you have a situation where Tipu Sultan is essentially dislodged because he's not going along with the aims of the East India Company, which later then became the British Empire in India. And he's sort of very brutally dislodged. What happens in the aftermath, according to British sources, British military figures who are writing letters home, who are writing diaries, who say, there's levels of brutality here. Women are running because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them. People are having the possessions stolen. There's plunder. There's fires in the streets, and that's not coming from Indian sources. That's coming from British sources that you can still read today, who are themselves horrified at the state of what's happening. And Tipu Sultan's objects end up being scattered all around Britain, and still are today. So if you go into any museum or art gallery and you see something with a tiger, 99% of the time you will find that it's linked to Tipu Sultan, because the tiger was his symbol. And so there's a sort of very visible reminder of what happened under the British Empire. That's one specific episode I draw out. So, it's not to say things were somehow better in the past. These terrible things happened. And yet, at the same time, we have earlier stories, or maybe even parallel stories of, as you say, genuine curiosity, genuine inspiration, and a desire to forge links. So two things can be true at once.
Absolutely, and actually on that on the chapter on Tipu Sultan, I think the thing that you also really bring out is the way that the narrative around that has been framed by Britain, which is this portrayal of Tipu Sultan as being a villain, being really, you know, evil, and that the British East Asia Company kind of came in as this like benevolent force that was going to come and save people, and but actually it was incredibly bloody. Like I think you describe the streets in the book kind of being painted red almost because of how much bloodshed there was. You question, and historical sources question as well, exactly why that happened. Was it because Tipu Sultan was villainous and they were trying to save people from him, or was it actually about conquest and power? And I really like that. I love this being really forced and encouraged to rethink Britain's role in the world and the role of the empire. And obviously, like your book is full of some really like wonderful and really fascinating stories, like the structure of the mosque in Kew Gardens, which is just so lovely to read and really, really interesting. But also this really dark side to history, which is often so washed away or diluted or just ignored. Yeah, what was it like for you, I guess, in terms of finding out some of that history and deciding to include it and write it? Yeah, what was that like?
I mean, you mentioned the mosque at Kew Gardens. We should probably explain that a little bit. So the mosque at Kew Gardens doesn't exist anymore. If you go and try and find a mosque at Kew Gardens, you won't find one. You won't even find a sign that anything ever existed. And yet, I believe that the very first mosque structure, when I say mosque structure, not mosque with practicing worshippers, stood at Kew Gardens and was built in 1762, commissioned by Princess Augusta, the mother of King George III. And to me, that's sort of an incredible fact that the first mosque structure in the UK was commissioned by a princess and stood at Kew Gardens and was designed, it was called the Turkish Mosque. It was designed very carefully to emulate what an actual mosque would look like, whether that's sort of incorporating the geometric symbols, minarets, verses from the Quran were written onto it. A great effort was made to sort of make it look accurate. And it was part of a trio of objects. So you had a Turkish mosque, an Alhambra arch to mimic the Alhambra at Granada, and a Chinese pagoda. And the only one, for anyone who's gone to Kew Gardens and will know, still standing is the Chinese pagoda. I remember when I first sort of came across this detail in a book I was reading, just, you know, it was a sort of throwaway mention about a Turkish mosque at Kew Gardens. I remember thinking, what? Turkish mosque at Kew Gardens, Alhambra arch. So, but why is this pagoda the only one remaining? And these two have gone. And so for me, it was quite exciting and intriguing to sort of go on this detective hunt a lot of the time to sort of say, you know, either what is this object, or in this case, what happened to this object? Where is it? Why did it disappear? And I don't want to give away too much. You know, people can read it in the book, but you know, I sort of had to go on a hunt to find out more about this object that didn't exist anymore. There's a sketch of it included in the book that people can have a look at, so we have an idea of what it looked like. And you know, I would make several trips to Kew Gardens where I know the exact place where it is, and I tell you in the book if you want to go and have a look for yourself. And I would sort of close my eyes and visualize what it would be like if it was still there today. And I've often said to people, I wonder what the reaction would be if somebody said, let's reinstate the mosque at Kew Gardens. You know, what would the reaction be? And I use that chapter, as I say, you know, I don't just talk about the history and the art and culture, but I use each chapter to reflect on something modern day. And that one, for me, was just a very obvious example of, well, if that was the very first mosque, what is the reaction to mosque building and the presence of a mosque in Britain today? And I look at, you know, one particular example of a community in Lincoln and the sort of far-right hostility that they faced in their town in trying to just build a simple mosque for worshippers, even when they had the support of many people in the local community. The sort of way in which tensions were stirred up by the far right in that community is something that I look at, and is sort of an example of things something that does happen around the country today. And you know, it's not to say that if we suddenly told these members of the far right, well, do you know the first mosque structure was commissioned by the mother of King George III, that it would change their mind? But it might shift other people's minds, and I think it gives us a little bit more context about the place of mosques in Britain today. It sort of gives us another layer. So for me, learning about these objects, finding out about these objects was, I sort of treated it like a bit of a detective hunt. And I mean, I took this research took place over a number of years, partly because I was working full time as a journalist while doing it. But I kind of tricked myself into thinking, well, this is just just finding out about things as part of the research overall. And sometimes it would be frustrating because I'd come across something and then just not get any further with it. And you think, so one example I can give you, for instance, we talked about Tipu Sultan's objects being brought to Britain. One of the objects that was brought to Britain in pieces was his throne. They had this sort of octagon-shaped throne with jewel-crusted tiger finials that are really, really valuable and expensive today, as you can imagine. And because it was an octagon shape, there were 8 of them. And again, you can see a picture of these in the book. But only 2 or 3 of them we know where they are today. We don't know where the others are. And I like to think that somewhere in an attic somewhere, in a castle, maybe someone's inherited some colonial loot and maybe don't even know it. But you sort of get the frustration of like, you don't know where the others are. Are they destroyed? Do they exist somewhere? But quite difficult to trace. So not everything has answers, but that was part of the sort of journey.
Absolutely. And I think when it comes to uncovering some of the darker sides of the British Empire, there has been a lot of good work being done recently, and I think especially around the partition, India-Pakistan partition. But there's still a long way to go. But I think, so many sources or so many of the documentaries being produced or the books being written are from sources that come from India and Pakistan itself. So it'll be families that have been devastated or torn apart because of partition. But most of the sources that you use are from Britain. Did you find any kind of blocks? Did you find that there was enough information available? Because I know you write in the introduction that one of the things that you were frustrated with when visiting sites initially was when you'd ask guides a question about something, they just won't have the information. So how hard was it really, or how easy was it to get that information?
So I mean, the thing with guides is it's 2 things. Sometimes people genuinely wouldn't know, I want to acknowledge that many of these people are volunteers who just give up their time to try and show people around the place. And maybe some of the knowledge they have has just come from their own interest. And we're all interested in different things based on our background and our own personal interests. So, when you only get a certain profile of person volunteering at a site, maybe you're only going to get that slice of information. If you get people who are only interested in deep military history, for instance, then you're going to get lots of information about that, but not very much else. So sometimes it was that, and sometimes people are projecting their own political opinions. When they're guiding you around, and I give examples of that. So in the first instance, I would say, I think one of the sort of call to arms of my book is to say to people, we should all get involved in telling this history, because the history belongs to all of us, and that means that if that means getting involved with your local National Trust or English Heritage or whatever heritage site, and ensuring that they tell a full story and being a part of that, whether it's volunteering or getting a job there, etc., that we all need to be a part of that story. I don't want to lay the blame on any one figure. I think it's on all of us to tell that story, as well as the institutions. On using British sources, I was very clear that this is a British history book, and it's important. Stories of people who are descendants of empire, where India, Pakistan, other places, are really important. They have their place, but that was not what this book is. This is about looking at what happened in Britain through British eyes. And one of the ideas of that is to say, when we're talking about, for instance, colonial brutality, that's not somebody, Indian or Pakistani or whatever saying that. That's being expressed by a British military figure in a letter at the time to their loved one, or in a diary at the time. So yeah, I spent a lot of time at the British Library and other archives looking through these archives. It's not always straightforward, but once you get into it, you find a rhythm, and then one thing leads you to another, and you read about one thing, and then you realise that something else might exist in someone else's diary might be useful. And I did a lot of reading around all of these things. I mean, I personally, love looking at archives. It's one of my sort of quite sad. I love looking at sort of old diaries and letters. I know that's not for everyone, so I love doing it. But it does take a lot of time. Having said that, one of the incredible things about the British Empire is, although we know that many documents were destroyed after certain incidents, for instance, relating to the Mau Mau in Kenya, we know factually that documents were burned around that, but many other things were sort of extensively logged and documented. And so we still have those. And, the final chapter of the book ends at the First World War, and you have soldiers from the Indian subcontinent fighting for Britain in the trenches in Europe. When they find themselves injured, they're brought to Brighton and other hospitals on the south coast, and I look at their experiences. One of the incredible things was, they would write letters home, but all letters at the time, not just theirs, but all letters at the time would have been censored by the War Office. And you have these incredible books and books of archives of censored letters. And, some of those were really moving, because you have these young men who are injured really far away from home, writing to family or friends about their trauma, about the political circumstances, the cultural circumstances that they find themselves in, about the reality of war. And many of those letters never made it to their family members because they were censored. But the sensorial archive kept hold of them. And so we're able to hear from them in their own words, which I thought was really sort of powerful. So it was sort of irony in the censorship that, in a way, it allowed their voices to be heard decades later.
Yeah. I think I love your book because, as you said, like, going through archives isn't everyone's cup of tea, but it's also not possible for a lot of people to do that. And what your book, and I think there's other work being done too, is it makes this sort of hidden or uncovered history accessible. And what we hope is that it becomes more widely read and more widely known, and it changes or asks of people to reconsider what they thought they knew and the views that they have therefore developed today. I think that's the biggest thing, right? Is it's not just, acknowledging what happened before. It's then thinking about, well, where does that leave us today? Where does that leave where we stand on certain things and how we behave as people and as communities today? So really brilliant. And you talk in the book, there's this line that really actually stood out to me, where you talk about Britain recognizing its own cultural inheritance as complex and as a society that is also multilingual. And you say that, it's not that it has like a narrow set of beliefs. And you talk about it in relation to loyalty and obedience. And you say, well, how can we ask for loyalty when there isn't a certain set of beliefs? And I just wondered if you could reflect on that, because I had to put the book down after I read that and really think about what that means, because Britain has never been a homogenous society, even when it was so fiercely led by the church or by royalty. It has never had one set of beliefs. And yet somehow when we talk about being British or being loyal to Britain, that implies that therefore that there must be a set of rules. But it's such a messy, such a contradiction. So I wondered if you could just reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in political discourse, and this is not one political party, I think, all sides do this, where they start talking about Britishness or British values or what it means to be British in a very narrow way, according to what the political circumstances of the day are dictating. And actually, when you look at the history of Britain, and you look at whether it's political decisions being made pragmatically, cultural influences that I express throughout the book, it's not that straightforward. It's not an ideological republic. There's not a sense of, we don't stand up and pay allegiance to the flag, or children don't do that in schools, and quite rightly so. And that's something that Britain has prided itself on not doing. And so it's that what I was reflecting on there is to say, if you look at these histories, whether it's looking at Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria in a new light, with these other aspects of their histories. It's a chance to say that there are many different strokes of Britishness, and that also it can be what we want it to be. We can reflect on this history together and acknowledge the dark side of it, maybe praise or even celebrate some aspects of it as a way of finding common ground, but be truthful and honest about what happened, instead of sort of imagining that there was this, cut off island called England that then went on to form a British Empire and did everything by itself, economically and politically. That's just not true. Didn't happen. History didn't unfold in that way. And so much of, whether it's the buildings around us, the artwork in these heritage sites is still influenced today. One of the more unusual heritage sites I look at is the Foreign Office building itself. And there's a key courtyard called the Durbar Court, which has some very, very interesting history. I won't go into all of that now, but indeed still has the architecture of the British Empire in India engraved into its very building. And that's the building where foreign policy is made in Britain today. And I thought that was a very, very fascinating place in itself. And that's somewhere, we talked about accessibility. It was important to me that people, not everyone's going to be able to go to all of these sites anyway, because they're around the country, and it sometimes can be expensive to go to a heritage site. They're not always free. Sometimes they cost a lot, particularly if you're going with a family. So I wanted to make these things accessible to people as possible. But with something like the Foreign Office, it's very rare that you would get a chance to go there unless you were invited to an official reception or you go on one of the open days that they hold like once or twice a year. So I wanted to be able to sort of bring these visuals to people in a way that they would be able to understand and experience, because I think it's a history that sort of deserves to be shared, because it allows us to rethink what is Britain today, what does Britishness mean, and not just have one narrow set of people with a narrow set of beliefs impose it on us, to be able to own it for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you find any of your own ideas or things challenged throughout the process of researching and writing the book?
I tried to in the initial stages when I was researching specific objects and histories, I tried to sort of keep as blank a canvas as possible, because I think that's quite important when you're researching something, to not make too many preconceptions about what was happening or an object until you have evidence for it. It's purely whether you want to call it a journalistic or a historical exercise. You want evidence for the thing that you're saying, and in a lot of instances, I sort of let things speak for themselves. There's some analysis in the book, but I will just present to you something someone says in a diary or a letter, and it doesn't need further explanation. Actually, I would say even though I sort of sometimes I know what I was looking for. So with the Moroccan ambassador, that story starts out where I saw a gigantic portrait of a man on horseback at Chiswick House in West London, and it just had a really small plaque underneath it saying the Moroccan ambassador, and that was it. It might have changed since, but that's all that it had. And I just remember thinking, who's the Moroccan ambassador? And I'd uncover his story, and it turned out he was one of the Moroccan ambassadors who was sent to the Stuart court, and before him came the Moroccan ambassadors who were sent to the Elizabethan court. I think I was surprised by the sort of level of engagement that these individuals took part in, even to be entertained in sort of English noble homes and be venerated in the way they were. I think I was quite surprised by that, actually. I sort of had an idea that these exchanges must exist, but I was quite taken aback with the level of detail. So that was interesting, yeah.
And what are some of your kind of hopes for the book? Like, what do you hope people will take from it? And do you have any advice, I guess, on like what we can do to encourage others to rethink their approach to the British Empire and history narratives in general?
Well, I mean, a key hope for it is that some of this history becomes more widely shared, that we can no longer talk about it being hidden. You know, that for me, that would be a success if it became much more mainstream, whether that's in schools or through cultural production. And, you know, I've had lots of, when I've been meeting readers around the country, you know, somebody said to me, for instance, why can't we have a Bridgerton or a Bridgerton style drama around Elizabeth I and the Moroccan ambassador? And I thought, why not? You know, that would be great because it would bring that history to life. So, you know, I'd love for there to be more cultural production, more educational content based on some of this history, and for it to be more widely known. And as I say, some of that is on us. It's to be able to tell people, you know, did you know this existed? And to share that more widely with our friends and family and beyond and communities. For advice for people, I guess one is, if you go into a heritage site first of all. You know, go into these spaces. Don't feel that they're not for you, because I've heard people say, "Oh, I didn't know that I'd find anything interesting in these spaces." Well, turns out there is. You just have to look for it. Go into these spaces and don't be afraid to ask questions. But if you're going to make pronouncements about history or any particular thing, then do so with knowledge. Make sure you equip yourself with that knowledge in order to be able to talk about it properly. You know, I don't want to be in a situation where people superficially start sort of saying X or Y and this happened or that happened. You know, and sometimes that can take us down a misleading path. You know, I mean, a sort of example I can think of is, you know, people might read something about the American context and impose it onto Britain. You know, where they talk about suffragettes, and they talk about American suffragettes. They've read something about American suffragettes and they assume the same applied to suffragettes in Britain, and it was different, right? So, you know, make sure you arm yourself with the facts of history, and you really bring knowledge into a conversation when you want to speak with authority about British history or indeed the future. But to not be afraid to do that, and to ask questions and to seek out things. I think, you know, when we talk about these heritage sites, many of them depend on the funds from visitors and supporters, and so, you know, for some of them, there's an economic argument. If there are enough people coming in and asking questions about certain things, then yes, they would have to make sure that they are giving out that history because people want to know about it and they'll respond to that demand. So, yeah, ask questions and equip yourself with knowledge.
And just one final question, actually. On a personal level, even if you're not a person of colour or whatever, but you're somebody that is rethinking your understanding of history, of migration, of the empire, and you're dealing with this new or relatively new information about the dark side of the empire. And at the same time, you can also see that there was goodness and there was some level of tolerance and curiosity and friendship. And also, you know, that, you know, even if you look at Britain today, there's wonderful, wonderful things about British society and community. How do we kind of, how do we kind of deal with and navigate those two sides, and especially when one of them is really, really dark, and trying to own that side of history as well?
Well, I mean, when it comes to sort of talking about darker episodes, I think it comes back to the idea of dealing with sort of historical fact. You know, one of the reasons that I use British sources is that people can't turn around and say, well, that's your opinion, or, you know, you would say that. Well, I'm not saying that. These are historical facts from the archives and sources that you know, written by people Britain's respect. You know, it's the Duke of Wellington saying that. It's not me, for instance. I think that it goes back to sort of sometimes, you know, we can argue about, you know, the nuances of history and whether something was right or wrong, but when there's actual evidence of a brutality taking place, you can't deny that it happened. That's not to say that, you know, I mean, I'm very glad you said that this is not just for people of colour. You know, I think this is a story. These are stories for everyone. Yes, some people will find them sort of more personally inspiring or feel personally connected because of their family history, maybe. But it's for all of us. You know, it's a shared story for all of us to be able to talk about the realities of history, not just for people of colour. And having said that, you know, that doesn't mean that, white people or ordinary people in Britain should somehow feel responsible for what happened under the British Empire. I don't think anyone's saying that, and that's, we have to be clear about that. Unless your family's directly proceeding from the plunder of empire or slavery or whatever, and there are examples of that. You're not personally responsible, so we can sort of take the personal out of it a little bit. Maybe that helps. One of the things I wanted to be clear about is that these are not just nice stories. We could just talk about these things and say, well, isn't that a nice story? Isn't it lovely to know that? But we have to go away and do something with that and be aware that those histories have shaped and informed the country today, for better or worse, and that we should be conscious of that.
Yeah, and I think it's a reminder as well that, like, if we think about telling stories, if we think about sharing knowledge, the onus is on all of us. It's not just on people of colour, it's not just on white British people, it's on all of us, because this is our history and it's our island as well. And you say, by choice and by bondage we made these islands too. Like, it's all of us together. It's not just one person's or one group's history. So thank you so much for your time today, Fatima. I absolutely loved speaking to you, and I hope more people pick up Hidden Heritage. And just thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much to Fatima for such an interesting, insightful and incredible conversation. I loved every second of it and hope you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.